Back to Way Too Early, exactly 5:30 here on the East Coast, 2:30 out west. I'm Ali Vitale. Recent focus groups with more than a dozen Gen Z voters held earlier this month reveal economic anxiety is at the top of young people's list of political concerns. The group told the Up and Up's Rachel Genfaza many of them are juggling multiple jobs, relying on student loans and credit cards to cover basic expenses. The findings suggest candidates who directly address young voters' economic anxiety might have an advantage in appealing to this key voting bloc ahead of the midterms. Rachel joins me here on set with more. She is the founder, again, of Up and Up, a research firm and newsletter focused specifically on Gen Z. And I think when we talk about going into a midterm election that is going to be all about affordability concerns and why it doesn't make sense politically, as we started the show, for Trump to be doing primetime addresses on an election that's already done and dusted in the minds of voters, instead, he should be talking about the central concern they have. You're speaking directly to these young voters who are saying, I just don't feel like the system works for me. And this isn't even a new concept for them. They've been saying this.
Totally. Thank you, Ali, for having me.
Of course.
What we're hearing in our focus groups is that economic anxiety is underlying all of the other issues that young people care about. It is so intersectional, and they are looking for candidates who are willing to address that head on. I think some of the problem that they have seen in the past with candidates is that it feels like they're being gaslit, saying, hey, no, the economy is actually pretty good, everything's okay, but they don't feel that way. And that matters, what they're experiencing on the day-to-day, and the fact that, as you said, it came up that they are juggling multiple jobs, working retail, working shifts on campus if they're a student, working their way through college, using student loan refunds to actually pay for their lives, for textbooks, for rent. And this is what they're dealing with, and it will show up in the midterm results.
It will show up in the midterm results. And I think when I hear voters say, you know, my concern is X and I need the party to do Y, the question I ask them next is there anyone doing that well right now? And you got an answer from them.
I did. So I've been asking who are the candidates across the country who are resonating with you right now, who are doing a good job. And one name came up over and over again. It didn't matter their party ID. It didn't matter where they were from. And that person was New York Mayor Zohran Mamdani. And so I went a layer deeper and I said, okay, you mentioned Mamdani. What is it about him that you like? And oftentimes, the answer was more in sort of vibes and energy rather than policy. And so they're saying that he represents hope, he's representing change, he's bringing a new, fresh energy to the city and really to the country. And I went, I said, okay, there's been a lot of talk this summer about democratic socialism and the rise of democratic socialists. Do you consider yourself a democratic socialist? And not one person said that they were willing to label themselves that way.
Because they feel that that's a bad label, but they like the candidates?
So overall, Gen Z is anti-label.
Yeah.
They don't like labels when it comes to anything, let alone their politics. They don't like being boxed in. This generation is very swingy, too, when it does come to their political ideology, and overwhelmingly independent. And so that's one piece of it. They also don't really know what democratic socialism means.
Yeah.
We talked a bit about that. Some people said, I feel like I heard about it in history class. I feel like I'm only now hearing about it with Zohran Mamdani. I'm not really sure. Some participants said that they feel that their parents have a negative association with the word, and so they didn't really want to identify that way because of that. And then others actually expressed a difference of opinion with the DSA chapters in their local communities and the way that they go about doing politics. And one thing that I think is really underrated about this voting bloc is that they've grown up amid total polarization, infighting, chaos.
Trump era.
Totally. Like their entire lives have been dictated by the Trump era of politics. And they want to go back to a more peaceful politics. And that has come up in the conversations when talking about their aversion to the label of DSA as well.
Which is so fascinating because when I look at some of the names that they're bringing up, you talk about Mamdani, but then they're also pointing to AOC. They're pointing to Jasmine Crockett, who's now going to be an outgoing member of Congress after losing her Senate bid. They're talking about Melat Kiros, who won the primary to knock off a longtime Democratic incumbent in Colorado. And yes, politically, those people have a common thread, having covered them. But it also strikes me that they are young, mostly non-white, non-male in a lot of those cases, other than Mamdani. Is that part of this, too, that this generation just wants to see people talking to them who don't look like everyone else who's always talked to them in politics?
Yes, and I know you focus on this a lot in your work covering women candidates as well. But their representation matters, and they want to see someone who they feel like reflects them and their experience, their personal experience, and who has been through things that they have gone through. And they also want someone who's a fighter. And so in this round of focus groups, those were the names that came up. But I did some earlier this summer, and other names that came up were Jon Ossoff, who seems to really be having a moment in the way that he is resonating with all people, but young people in particular. And they're really just looking for candidates who have a clear vision and who are able to express that vision. And I think that's some of why we're seeing these more left-leaning candidates do well with young people right now, is because they're offering what they stand for rather than just what they oppose. And that is really important. When we ask, what are you looking for in a politician? One of the words that came up over and over again was vision.
A proactive message as opposed to a reactive one about the politics of right now, especially given the fact, and this is something Democrats broadly are grappling with right now, is as the Trump era comes to a close, because he is not running again, his time is done, the party is going to move on. They have to figure out, where do Democrats go next, as not just a party that is a referendum on Trump, which midterms largely are, but what happens after that? And this kind of work that you're doing is going to be really instructive for it. I think it's fascinating. Please keep coming back to us with these focus groups. They're really, really great. Rachel Jen Faza, thank you.